The accident that never ended. I didn't hear the scream right away. It was too windy on the ridge, the pines groaning against each other, their branches scraping like bone fingers. My boots crunched on frost, the air sharp enough to bite my teeth when I breathed through my mouth. I thought the noise behind me was just the mountain shifting, until I turned and saw him. Eli was still standing, swaying slightly, like he'd forgotten which way was down. His right hand was gripping the jagged edge of a limestone outcrop, his knuckles bloodless. The other hand, it was bent backwards in a way a hand should never bend. There was something on the rock, a smear, thick and dark, already starting to bead like syrup in the cold. I didn't move at first. I was still trying to match the sight to a cause. He'd been only a few paces behind me. Then there was a sound, not a scream, not exactly, a wet, choked cough, and I saw the red blooming on his chin. The wind caught it, smearing it across his cheek. It wasn't until he slipped that the smell hit me. Not metallic, not right away. More like something warm turned sour. His boots skidded on frost, and for a moment he was just hanging there, his jacket snagged on the rock, eyes wide and glassy, looking at me but not seeing. I stepped toward him, careful, too careful, the way you move when you're holding something fragile, but the moment I got close enough to grab his arm, the fabric tore. The sound was soft, but it's burned into my ears, the hiss of threads snapping, the whisper of cloth peeling away from skin. He went down in silence, the space he left behind filling instantly with the hiss of the wind. When I reached the ledge and looked down, I expected to see him sprawled and still. Instead, I caught the flick of movement, a shoulder twisting, his legs scrabbling at the loose shale, hands pawing the ground as though trying to hold on to something invisible. And then, like the earth swallowed him whole, the movement stopped. I called his name until my throat hurt, each shout swallowed faster than the last. The drop wasn't sheer, it sloped into a thicket of black spruce maybe 30 feet down, the shadows so dense they looked like a hole in the world. And then I heard it, a single, sharp breath. Not a gasp, not a moan. Just a breath, drawn slow and deep, like someone waking up in a dark room and realizing they aren't alone. I slid down the ridge on my side, shale biting through my pants, the cold turning my hands stiff and useless. The spruce swallowed me quicker than I expected, their branches knitting over my head, shutting out the pale sky. The air here was thicker, damp, carrying the earthy rot of wet needles and something else, copper and sweet, a smell I already knew was his blood. Eli, I called again, softer now, not wanting to hear my own voice bounce back at me. No answer. Then, movement. Not far ahead, between two bent trunks. His boot sole, just visible, the tread catching a flash of light. I forced myself forward, my knees sinking into the spongy ground, the cold seeping up through my legs. When I reached him, I saw his head turned at a strange angle, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. His skin was already too pale for comfort, the edges of his mouth cracked and glistening. I touched his shoulder, meaning to shake him gently, but the fabric was wet. The cold dampness soaked into my palm, sticky, almost clinging. I drew my hand back without thinking, and it came away slick and dark, the smell rushing up at me like a fist. My stomach twisted. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for that pulse, that small, rhythmic proof that I hadn't just watched my friend die. Something fluttered against my fingertips, once, twice, and then was gone. "Hey," I whispered, leaning closer, so close my breath fogged over his cheek. "Eli, you're fine, you're..." His eyes opened. They didn't snap open the way I'd imagined. No jolt, no sudden intake of breath. Just a slow, dragging blink, lids lifting heavy over eyes that didn't look quite right. The pupils were wide, swallowing almost all the color, and yet, he was looking past me. Through me. My first thought was concussion. My second was that maybe I was imagining the faint twitch of his lips. And then I realized, he wasn't trying to speak. He was listening. What is it? I asked before I could stop myself. My voice was too loud here, in this smothered green dimness. That's when I heard the other sound. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the wind pushing against the spruce above, but it was there, a slow, deliberate shifting in the needles behind us, the kind of sound a large animal makes when it's deciding whether to move closer. I looked over my shoulder, but the shadows layered over each other, depth collapsing into a single wall of black. I turned back to Eli. He was gone. No, not gone, he was crawling, dragging himself deeper into the thicket with jerky, desperate motions. I called his name again, but he didn't look back. He was fast, faster than someone in his state should have been, and in seconds the branches closed behind him. I hesitated only a moment before following. The branches clawed at my face as I pushed after him, the scent of sap bursting sharp in my nose every time I tore through a limb. I could hear him ahead, his breathing, uneven and fast, each exhale dampened by the moss under us. The ground began to slope downward. My boots slipped on the wet needles, sending me into a half-run, half-fall. At one point my hand caught something rough, bark flaking under my fingers, and I realized it wasn't a trunk, it was a root, thick and twisted, jutting up like the spine of some buried thing. The air was colder here, pockets of it sinking in from somewhere unseen. My ears picked up that same shifting sound from before, but now it was closer. It wasn't pacing us, it was circling. Eli! I hissed, but my voice didn't carry far in this heavy air. Stop, just. A sharp crack, like bone splitting under pressure, cut through my words. I froze. It had come from the right, where the trees thinned into a patch of open ground covered in pale lichen. And that's when I saw him. Eli was on his knees at the far side of the clearing, head bent, shoulders heaving. From here, I couldn't see his face, but there was something in the way his arms hung, stiff, almost puppet-like, that made my skin prickle. I started toward him, careful where I stepped. The lichen felt wrong under my boots, soft, almost spongy, with a faint give that suggested more than just dirt underneath. It seemed to absorb sound, muting everything but the wet rasp of my own breathing. When I reached him, I touched his back. His shirt was torn and clinging to his skin. It wasn't just blood now, it was something else, a thin, blackish smear that smelled faintly of metal and something sour, like fruit gone bad. He lifted his head slowly. His cheek was scraped raw, blood matting the stubble there, but it was his eyes that stopped me. They were wrong. Not just wide, but locked onto something behind me, the way prey watches a predator approach. I turned. The trees at the clearing's edge shifted, not from wind, but as if the trunks themselves had leaned in closer. Between them, shadows folded and unfolded, shapes that almost resembled figures if I stared too long. A faint whisper threaded through the air, too low to make out words. It might have been wind through pine. It might have been something else. When I looked back at Eli, he was smiling. Not wide, not friendly, just the bare suggestion of it, enough to show the red smear between his teeth. You didn't see it, he said, voice ragged, but it saw you. I didn't move. His words hung in the damp air like a breath that wouldn't leave. My hand was still on his shoulder, but I could feel how tense he was, his muscles drawn tight, ready to spring or shatter. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He didn't answer. His gaze flicked past me again, and without meaning to, I followed it. There was nothing there. Just the dark space between the trees, the kind of dark that didn't seem to wait for night to arrive. Still, my skin felt like it was shrinking around me. Eli shifted, his weight pressing harder into the spongy ground. The faint gib beneath us made me think of the smell, wet rot, faint but steady, like an animal that had been buried shallow. "You remember the creek?" he asked suddenly, voice flat. Of course I did. The memory jolted through me, mud, a cold rush of water, and the sound of my own voice screaming his name. His foot had caught between two submerged rocks, and in the panic of trying to free him, I'd shoved too hard. There'd been that awful moment when his head cracked against something under the surface. I could still see the cloud in the water, the bloom of blood breaking apart in slow, pulsing tendrils, and I could still smell it. The copper tang mixed with the algae swampy sweetness. He'd come up gasping that day. Alive. Swearing he was fine. But now, staring at him here, it was as if that accident had never ended. "I think," Eli said, looking down at his own hands, "something stayed with me. Or maybe I stayed with it." A shiver passed through the clearing, not the air, but the ground itself, like something shifting beneath the lichen. I stepped back instinctively, and the soft layer under my boot seemed to collapse inward for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. "Eli," I said, and my own voice didn't sound right, too shallow, too fast. "We need to go." He tilted his head, as if listening for something only he could hear. Then he looked at me again, and there was a strange wet shine in his eyes. "What if it doesn't want us to?" Behind him, the shadows between the trees rippled. Eli's words barely had time to settle before a sound rose from beneath us, faint at first, like water dripping into a hollow space. But the longer I listened, the more it seemed to take shape. It wasn't dripping. It was breathing. I stepped back again, the ground yielding unnaturally, my heel sinking into the damp moss until I could feel the slick resistance of mud. The smell sharpened, wet iron, sour and metallic, and something else underneath, rancid like old meat sealed away too long. "Stop moving," Eli hissed, but there was no anger in it, just fear stretched thin. The shadows behind him seemed to bend toward us, and in that dim light, I noticed his hands trembling. Not from cold. From strain, like he was holding something in place. "What are you doing?" I asked. His jaw clenched. "If you don't move, maybe it won't." He trailed off, eyes darting to my feet, and then to the soft depression in the moss where my boot had sunk. Something pressed up from beneath. It wasn't a rock. Rocks don't shift like they're breathing against your skin. My foot shot back instinctively, and the moss swelled where it had been, slow, deliberate. A memory tore into me, Eli's head going under, his body thrashing once before going limp, my hands hauling him up, the terrible thought that he was gone. That smell. That water. That coppery taste in my mouth when I screamed for him. "Eli," I said again, my voice fraying, "you're scaring me." His eyes were on the ground now, watching as the moss pulsed upward in uneven bursts. "It's not me." Something broke the surface, a slick, pale curve, almost like knuckle bone, but too long, too narrow. It withdrew instantly, as though retreating into the soil, leaving only the shallow hollow and the stink of rot. I staggered back, my hand gripping the nearest tree. The bark was damp and flaking, and when I looked down, my palm was streaked with something dark, thick. Not sap. "I told you we shouldn't have come here," Eli said softly, and now I could see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "It remembers." The breathing beneath us deepened. Somewhere to our left, further in the trees, a branch snapped, but it didn't fall. It was wrenched down, cracking sharply, as if something huge had pulled it toward the earth. The moss at my feet began to rise again. The moss rose higher this time, swelling like a lung filling with air. I could hear it now, not just breathing, but something wet shifting inside, a faint grinding like bone on stone. My stomach turned at the sound. Eli grabbed my wrist so hard it burned. "Don't step back again. Don't give it space." I didn't understand, but the panic in his grip told me enough. I froze, rooted to the spot, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. From the swelling mound, a slit began to form, splitting the moss and earth in a slow, deliberate tear. At first it was small, no wider than a finger, but it kept parting, revealing something slick and dark beneath. The smell hit harder, hot copper, wet leaves, and the unmistakable stench of blood that's been left to bake in the sun. "Eli." I could barely force his name out. He stepped between me and the opening, his back to it. "Don't look at it." But I already had. Inside the tear, beneath the layer of moss and soil, something pulsed with a faint, sluggish rhythm. Not quite like a heart, more like a wound struggling to clot, the edges flexing and unflexing. The memory slammed into me fully this time, not just Eli's drowning, but what came before. The water had been too dark, too deep. We'd been laughing 1 second, and then something had dragged him under. When I pulled him up, his mouth was filled with that same stink. His eyes were open, but I swear, something looked out from behind them. Now, staring at the opening in the earth, I realized the smell wasn't just familiar, it was identical. "Eli," my voice was shaking, "what happened that day, really?" He didn't turn. It didn't let go. The mound shuddered violently, and this time something pushed out. A shape, pale and ridged, glistening as if coated in a layer of clear jelly. It flexed, curling upward before sinking back in. The moss rippled outward like water disturbed by a drop. Somewhere beyond the trees, something else moved. Slow. Heavy. Coming closer. Eli's grip on my wrist tightened until I thought the bones might crack. "If it finds us together, it'll finish what it started." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, but the ground beneath my other foot sagged, the moss caving in as if something hollow had opened up under me. Eli yanked me forward, hard. The air beneath where I'd been standing rose in a hot, foul burst, and I swear I heard something like a whisper in it. The shape under the moss didn't retreat this time. It began to crawl. It moved without breaking the surface, but I could track it by the rise and fall of the moss, like a massive serpent swimming just under a sheet of green skin. The ground quivered as it passed under my feet. I could feel the texture of it through the thin soles of my boots, soft in the wrong way, like pressing on a bruise. Eli pulled me along, but my eyes stayed locked on the shifting bulge that shadowed us step for step. The smell was worse now, thicker, heavier, clinging to the back of my throat. It was the smell of metal, rot, and something faintly sweet, like fruit left to ferment until it burst. The sound came next. A wet dragging noise, as if it were pulling itself through mud, or through something denser, something with weight and resistance. The sound of flesh against flesh. "Don't stop," Eli whispered. But his voice didn't sound like Eli's voice anymore. There was a strain to it, something that made my skin prickle. I glanced at him, and in the dappled light slipping through the canopy, his skin seemed wrong. Not visibly wounded, but pale in a way that reminded me of old wax. The moss rippled closer, and then it pressed up against my ankle from underneath. I froze. It wasn't like an animal brushing against me. It was colder than the ground, slick, and it pulsed once, deliberately. I opened my mouth to scream, but Eli's hand clamped over it instantly. The pressure against my ankle vanished. The bulge slid away. I tried to wrench his hand off, but his grip was like iron. When I looked at him, his eyes were fixed on the ground a few feet ahead, wide and unblinking, like he was watching something I couldn't see. Finally, he removed his hand, but his voice was lower than a whisper when he spoke. "It's following the scent. Not ours. Mine." The words sat in my head for a second before they made sense. My throat tightened. "You didn't come back from the lake, did you?" He didn't answer. The moss between us shivered, and then a small split opened, no bigger than a coin. From it came a faint hiss, not quite a breath, not quite a voice, but layered with a sound I couldn't mistake. Bubbles breaking the surface of dark water. The split in the moss widened, slow at first, then with a sudden tearing sound that made my teeth hurt. The green surface curled back like peeling skin, revealing not soil, but a black, glistening pit beneath. The smell that poured out was suffocating, iron-heavy and wet, thick enough that breathing felt like swallowing blood. Bubbles rose from the darkness, each one bursting with a soft pop that sprayed tiny flecks onto my face. They were warm. Sticky. I stumbled back, but Eli didn't move. He was staring into that black water with an expression I'd never seen on him before, not fear, not awe, something hungrier. The surface inside the hole shifted, and something began to emerge. At first it looked like a pale branch breaking the waterline, but it bent in ways a branch couldn't, too many joints, too smooth, glistening with a translucent film. When the first hand surfaced, I almost screamed. It wasn't quite human, too long, with webbing between the fingers, and nails that were soft and pale as boiled skin. It rested on the edge of the moss, pressing down just enough to make it sag. Then another hand joined it, and together they pulled something up from the black. Eli whispered something under his breath. I didn't catch the words. The head broke the surface, hair slicked flat to a skull too narrow, too sharp at the jaw. The skin was the color of candle wax, with veins showing faintly blue beneath. The eyes. The eyes were open and pale, like milk. And yet, my stomach flipped. There was something familiar about the slope of the cheekbones, the curve of the mouth. I'd seen that face before. Not here. Not now. In the lake. The day of the accident. The moment I realized that, its lips moved. Water poured out instead of words, splashing over the moss and soaking into my boots. The ground trembled again. More splits opened in the moss around us, each one spilling that black water, each one accompanied by the faint sound of bubbles breaking. Eli's voice was closer now, almost in my ear. "It doesn't want you yet. It's still deciding." When I turned to him, the pale thing from the hole was smiling, but Eli was not. And for the first time, I couldn't tell which one was speaking. The air felt heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. My ears rang with the muffled throb of my own pulse, but beneath it was another rhythm, slow, wet, and deliberate, as though something was breathing just below my feet. The pale figure hadn't climbed out fully. It lingered half-submerged, its hands clutching the moss in a strangely delicate grip, fingertips brushing each blade of green like it was learning their texture. The ripples that spread from its body were wrong, they didn't fade. They moved outward, then back and again, as if the water itself was inhaling. Eli still hadn't moved. His shoulders were tight, but his hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed in a way that made my skin crawl. I whispered his name. No answer. When I stepped toward him, my boot sank deeper than expected, the moss sagging like wet carpet. The ground seemed to yield beneath me, and in that moment I understood, there was no solid earth under our feet at all. Just a stretched skin of moss, and beneath it, the black water. The smell thickened. Metallic. Rotting. There was another scent too, sharp and familiar. Like burnt hair. My stomach turned as a sound rose from the pit, so soft at first I thought it was wind in the branches. But the trees were still. No movement, no rustle. The sound grew louder, resolving into a layered chorus of whispers. Somewhere in the jumble, I heard my own name. Then, clearer, laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter that burst suddenly. It was slow, rising, like someone had been holding it in for a long time. The pale figure tilted its head, water sluicing off in ribbons. The eyes fixed on me. I tried to step back, but the ground pulled up my boots with a sucking sound. My hands trembled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but Eli finally moved. Only it wasn't toward me. It was toward it. His boots made no splash, no disturbance. Like he was walking somewhere he already belonged. The thing's mouth opened wider, water spilling in thick ropes, but now there were shapes in it, small, pale, and writhing, tumbling out onto the moss and squirming in frantic, soundless spasms before slipping back into the black. Eli reached down like he was about to take its hand. And I remembered. The day of the accident, Eli wasn't just with me. He was in the water before I was. I'd seen his arm around her, pulling her under. I had told myself it was a mistake. But now, I couldn't tell if she was the one pulling him in, or if he was returning to her. Eli's fingertips were inches from the thing's pale wrist when the moss beneath him quivered. It wasn't just the water breathing anymore, it was the ground, flexing under us like muscle. The smell hit harder now. Not just rot and iron, but something sour and meaty, like meat left out in summer heat until the air itself tastes wrong. My mouth filled with saliva I didn't want to swallow. The figure's skin didn't look like skin anymore. Up close, it had the texture of wet paper, thin enough that something darker shifted underneath. Veins? Worms? I couldn't tell, only that it moved. I opened my mouth to shout, but the sound that came out wasn't mine. It was a gurgle, thick and clogged, as if my throat were already full of water. Eli didn't turn. His posture was almost gentle, like he was greeting a lover after years apart. The pale hand rose to meet his, fingers long, joints bending at angles that hurt to watch. I took a step forward, and the moss under my boot gave way entirely. My leg plunged through the green into cold black, the water swallowing me up to the thigh in an instant. Something brushed against my skin, soft at first, then tightening. A grip. I yanked back hard. The thing holding me didn't resist in a normal way. There was no jerking, no struggle, just a slow, inevitable pull. Eli was waist deep now. His face was tilted toward the thing's ear, lips moving. I couldn't hear his words over the whispers coming from everywhere at once, some from the water, some from the trees, some from inside my own skull. One of them was her voice. The girl from that day. The one whose skull I had felt crack under my knee when we both went under in the current. And smiling. Her fingers didn't feel like fingers. They felt like a knot of riverweed, slick, fibrous, alive, wrapping around my windpipe. But instead of choking, she only pressed, just enough for me to feel the pulse in my neck jump to meet hers. Except there was no pulse in her. The touch made the world lose its edges. The swamp's darkness bled into the shape of another night, the riverbank years ago, the rush of water swollen with rain, my boots filling as I stumbled after her laugh. The moonlight flashing off the current like the surface of a blade. The sound of my own voice screaming her name, the splash when she fell. Except... no. That wasn't how it happened. Was it? The cold climbed my leg, not like liquid, but like ice spreading under skin. My fingers went numb, my chest tight. Every breath rasped, filling my lungs with a dampness that wasn't air. Eli turned his head toward me at last. His eyes were open too wide, the whites a muddy gray, and water dribbled from his mouth in a steady stream. "She's been waiting," he said. His voice sounded far away, like it had traveled a long way through water before reaching me. The pale figure's other hand shot out toward me, faster than I could flinch. Its fingers didn't close around my throat, they pressed against it, lightly. And in that touch, I felt everything, the cold of the river that night, the snap of bone under the surface, the stillness after. But in that memory, her eyes were open. I had told myself, over and over, that it was an accident. That my hand on her shoulder as she slipped was only to pull her back. That when I went under with her, I only pushed her down because the panic made me clumsy. But in this dark, with her touch on my neck, the truth felt heavier. The moss shivered again, no, breathed. Something below us was expanding, exhaling into the soil, shifting the water. Bubbles rose around Eli, popping with the faint smell of rot and something chemical, like formaldehyde. His hands weren't on her anymore. They were at his sides, limp, as she leaned close to him. Her mouth moved against his ear. What came out wasn't words, but a wet, clicking rhythm, like teeth snapping shut underwater. He didn't blink. I tried to move, but my leg was still caught. The pressure around my thigh tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to promise that if I fought, it would pull. Her head turned toward me again. The face was wrong now. Eyes black and deep, like two pockets of riverbed. The water streaming from her lips didn't fall straight down, it crawled along her chin in slow, deliberate threads. She let go of my neck. I thought I was free, until the skin where she had touched me stayed cold, a circle of frost in the heat of my body. "You left me there," she said. The words weren't sound. They slid into my skull the way water seeps into cloth, silent at first, then heavy, until you can't lift it anymore. And yet, she smiled. The same smile she'd worn before she fell. The ground under us gave another long, slow breath. The water lapped higher, licking at my waist now. Behind me, the trees seemed further away than they had any right to be, as if the swamp was stretching itself, pulling me deeper without my feet moving. Eli's lips parted, and in a voice not his own, he said, "She didn't drown." but the way he said it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a warning. The swamp held its breath. I was sinking, slow and steady, the black water rising like ink through my clothes, clutching at my skin with cold, wet fingers. The moss beneath us pulsed again, an impossible heartbeat from the earth itself, alive and watching. Eli's voice echoed around me, or maybe inside me. It wasn't really him anymore. The voice was hollow, distant, like it had traveled through tunnels of water and shadow before reaching my ears. She didn't drown. The words settled on my skin, icy and sharp. I could feel them burning in my bones. The pale figure leaned closer, her face inches from mine. The black pools where her eyes should have been swallowed the last light, pulling at the edges of my vision until the world slipped sideways. I wanted to scream, to break free, but the grip around my leg was firm and unyielding, a promise that the swamp would claim me too. "You left me," she whispered, voice a melody of sorrow and accusation. "No," I tried to say, but my voice was a strangled rasp swallowed by the thick air. "Didn't you?" she said, fingers weaving through the water as though drawing threads of memory. "You left me alone. You left me to wait." The cold deepened, reaching inside me like a claw. My breath caught in my throat as a flood of images crashed through my mind, the river's cruel current, the snap of bone, the water closing over her face, her eyes wide open, smiling. It wasn't an accident. It had never been. Eli's shape began to shimmer, the edges blurring like a reflection in disturbed water. His mouth moved again, a wet clicking sound that felt like teeth snapping beneath the surface. The swamp itself seemed to exhale, the dark water curling higher, swallowing the last scraps of solid earth. I fought to move, but the cold pulled tighter, dragging me down into the abyss. The pale figure smiled then, a slow, terrible smile that held both invitation and condemnation. "Join me," she breathed, voice dissolving into the water around us. And in that moment, the last line between the living and the drowned shattered. Darkness wrapped me whole. Weeks later, the ridge was quiet again. The trees whispered their secrets to the wind, and the moss grew thick, hiding what lay beneath. No one came searching for Eli or me, only the faintest echo of laughter threaded through the air on cold nights, as if the swamp itself remembered. The accident hadn't ended. It was waiting. The swamp's breath tightened around me, cold and merciless, squeezing the warmth from my bones as the black water rose inch by agonizing inch. It seeped through the moss and soil, swallowing roots and earth like a slow-moving tide of shadow. The air grew thick with the scent of iron and rot, the heavy, sour tang of things long buried and never quite dead. Eli's voice echoed distantly, fractured and broken, slipping between the water and my mind like a fragmented warning, a riddle I could not unravel. "She waits beneath. Always waiting." The words coiled in my skull, echoing over and over, drowning out everything else. The pale figure's eyes, voids as deep and endless as the bottomless water, were fixed on me. Her skin, thin and translucent like cracked porcelain, shimmered with the wet sheen of something not quite alive. Her lips parted in a smile too wide, too slow, stretching impossibly across a face that was no longer fully human. I tried to scream, to wrench myself free, but my voice was swallowed whole by the wet chorus of whispers rising from every shadow and hollow around us. The moss beneath my feet quivered like a heartbeat, pulsing with a life that was ancient and terrible. The black water crept higher, cold fingers curling around my waist, pressing me deeper into the abyss. Eli's eyes met mine one last time, empty, hollow, but filled with a desperate, unknowable something. A plea? A curse? Or perhaps just the reflection of the swamp's endless hunger? The pale figure's hand slid forward, brushing my cheek with a touch colder than the grave itself. Her fingers felt like wet riverweed, slick and fibrous, tracing lines of frost that spread slowly across my skin. Her smile twisted, a thing both beautiful and monstrous, a promise and a threat entangled into one. The water closed over us, dark and suffocating, swallowing the last traces of light and sound. In that final moment before the world slipped away, the swamp breathed once more, a slow, deep inhalation that echoed through the roots and stones, as if the earth itself was alive, watching, waiting. Then silence. Above the black water and thick moss, the forest stood still and quiet. The wind had died, and even the birds had fled. No footprints marred the soggy ground, no cries pierced the stillness. Only the faintest trace remained, a soft, lingering echo of laughter drifting on the cold breeze, as if the swamp itself whispered secrets meant only for the dead. The accident never truly ended. It had shifted, like a stone sliding beneath the surface of dark water, waiting patiently for the next ripple to awaken it again. And somewhere, beneath the quiet surface, the breathing continued.
Next story. The Doll's Whisper. The Matthews family was the picture of happiness. On a bright Saturday morning, the sun streamed through the wide windows of their new home, warming the freshly painted walls and the scent of new wood furniture. The sound of laughter filled the air as Jason Matthews, a lively 8-year-old boy with tousled brown hair, chased his younger sister Lily around the living room. "Gotcha!" Jason exclaimed, scooping her up into his arms, spinning her around until her giggles echoed like a melody. Their mother, Sarah, stood by the kitchen island, chopping vegetables for lunch, a gentle smile on her face. Their father, Mark, sat on the couch, scrolling through a tablet, watching his family with quiet pride. "This house is finally ours," Sarah said, her voice filled with warmth. "A fresh start for all of us." Jason grinned. "I love it here. The backyard is huge. I can't wait to play outside all summer." Mark nodded. "We worked hard for this. You two will have a safe place to grow up." As the family gathered around the table, Lily tugged on Jason's sleeve. "Can we go to the garage sale today? I want to find something special." Jason's eyes lit up. "Yeah. I want to find a toy or something cool." After lunch, the sun climbed higher, and the Matthews family piled into their car, heading towards a small neighborhood garage sale nearby. The street was lined with tables cluttered with forgotten treasures, dusty books, old lamps, weathered furniture, and boxes of toys. Children ran between houses, clutching toys they'd found, their faces alight with excitement. Jason wandered the tables, his eyes scanning for something unique. That's when he saw it, a doll sitting alone on a rickety wooden chair. It was oddly captivating. The doll's porcelain face was delicate, with painted blue eyes that seemed almost too real. Its dress was faded, stained with age, but carefully sewn with intricate lace. Jason picked it up carefully, feeling a chill run through his fingers. "Mom! Dad! Look what I found," he called out. Mark and Sarah approached, inspecting the doll. "It's old," Sarah remarked, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure you want that, Jason?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, it's cool. It feels different." The elderly woman running the sale smiled thinly. "That doll's been around a long time. Some say it holds memories, not all of them good." Jason frowned. "Like what?" "Oh, just stories," she said with a wink. Sometimes, toys like that choose their owners. Jason clutched the doll tighter as they paid for it, excitement bubbling in his chest. Back home, as dusk settled, the family gathered again in the living room. Jason placed the doll carefully on his nightstand before brushing his teeth. "Sleep tight, Mr. Blue Eyes," Jason whispered, smiling. Sarah tucked him in, smoothing his hair. "Good night, sweetheart." But as she turned to leave, she paused, a shadow crossing her face. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Jason's room was bathed in the pale glow of the moon. The doll sat motionless on the nightstand, until a soft, almost inaudible whisper slipped through the air. "Jason. Jason." Jason's eyes fluttered open. A shiver crawled down his spine. He reached out to the doll, but it was cold, impossibly cold. And somewhere deep inside, something else was stirring. The next morning dawned bright and cheerful, but Sarah couldn't shake a strange unease as she made breakfast. Mark was already dressed for work, chatting with the kids as they ate pancakes. "Jason, you ready for school?" Mark asked, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah. And Mr. Blue Eyes is coming with me," Jason said, holding up the doll. His voice held a strange pride, almost as if the doll were alive. Sarah forced a smile but kept a watchful eye. The doll's blue eyes seemed almost too shiny, almost too knowing. At school, Jason kept the doll tucked inside his backpack. When his teacher, Mrs. Lawson, asked what special thing he brought today, Jason proudly pulled out the doll. "It's from a garage sale." "Isn't she pretty?" he beamed. Some kids giggled, others gave curious glances. Jason was oblivious, or maybe just didn't care. Back home, Lily was eager to play with her brother, but Jason was different. He barely responded when she called, his attention glued to the doll sitting on his desk. That evening, Sarah found Jason sitting in the dim playroom, eyes fixed on the doll. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. "Jason, honey, it's time to get ready for bed," she said gently. He didn't answer. "Jason?" Mark entered the room, sensing something off. "Are you feeling okay?" Jason's head snapped up, eyes wide, but not with the usual warmth. There was something colder in his gaze. "I'm fine," he said, voice flat. The parents exchanged worried looks. Later that night, Sarah was awakened by the sound of muffled whispers coming from Jason's room. She crept down the hall, heart pounding. Peering through the doorway, she saw Jason sitting upright, staring at the doll. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam in the moonlight. "Jason?" she whispered. He didn't respond, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Come to me, Jason, the darkness calls." Sarah's breath caught. She stepped closer, and suddenly Jason's head turned slowly toward her, a chilling smile curling his lips. "Mom. I'm not alone," he said. The warmth of her son's voice was gone. The following days passed with an eerie subtlety. To Sarah and Mark, their son seemed changed. He wasn't the boy who'd run and laugh or build forts in the backyard. Now, he spoke in strange tones, his eyes distant and dark at times. One afternoon, Sarah found Jason in his room again, sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes fixed on the doll. The light from the window barely touched the corners of the room, leaving shadows lurking near the walls. "Jason, honey, come downstairs," Sarah called softly. He didn't move. Instead, his fingers twitched, tracing patterns in the air as if responding to invisible threads only he could see. "Jason, please," Mark said, entering the room. We're worried about you. Jason turned slowly, his gaze piercing. You don't understand. She talks to me. She shows me things. Sarah's heart pounded. Who, Jason? The doll? He nodded, lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. She says I'm special. That night, Mark and Sarah sat by the fireplace, whispering urgently. Something's wrong, Mark said, his voice low. This isn't just a kid's imagination. Sarah nodded, rubbing her temples. The doll, it's like it's alive. I don't know what to do. Determined to protect their son, they decided to research the doll's origins. Sarah called the elderly woman from the garage sale, but her number was disconnected. They scoured local records and libraries for any mention of similar dolls or strange happenings but found nothing concrete. Meanwhile, Jason's behavior worsened. At dinner, he sometimes spoke in voices that weren't his own, his eyes flashing with something unholy. His laughter turned hollow, echoing like a distant, broken melody. One night, as the storm raged outside, Sarah was woken by a crash downstairs. She found Jason standing in the living room, the doll clutched tightly in his hand, his face twisted in a grimace. Stop, she cried, reaching for him. But Jason's voice was cold, deepened. She told me to make the darkness come. Terror gripped Sarah's heart as the doll's eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light. Mark rushed into the room, his face pale as he saw Jason standing frozen, doll in hand, eyes wild. Jason, put the doll down. His voice cracked, heavy with panic. But Jason didn't move. Instead, his head twisted slowly, unnaturally, locking eyes with his father. The doll's porcelain face seemed to grin back in unison. The darkness is coming, Jason whispered, or maybe it was the doll speaking through him. The voice was layered, cold and hollow, impossible to place. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The room plunged into blackness except for the storm's flashes illuminating the terrified faces of the parents. Sarah, call someone, a priest, maybe. This isn't normal. Mark said, fumbling for his phone. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed. Through the static and rain, she explained the nightmare unraveling in their home. She could barely keep the shaking out of her voice. Meanwhile, Jason's body began to convulse. He collapsed to the floor, the doll slipping from his grasp, landing face down on the hardwood. From where it lay, an eerie, guttural sound leaked, like a voice trying to claw its way out of the porcelain prison. Get away from him! Sarah screamed, dropping the phone. She crawled to Jason's side, cradling his head. His eyes fluttered open, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw the boy she loved, frightened, desperate. Help me, he whispered. But the moment passed. His eyes darkened again, the warmth extinguished. The front door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, Father Callahan, clutching a worn leather Bible and a silver crucifix. His gaze was sharp, eyes scanning the room like a hunter. He approached cautiously. Where is the doll? Mark pointed weakly. Father Callahan picked it up carefully, holding it at arm's length. The doll's eyes seemed to glow brighter, a shadow shifting beneath its skin. This is no ordinary toy, Father Callahan murmured. It harbors something ancient. Something hungry. He turned to Jason, who now lay limp but trembling. We must fight this. You must stay strong, Jason. Your family is here. Sarah squeezed Jason's hand, tears streaming. Mark placed his hand on her shoulder, but the chill in the room was growing, suffocating and dark. Outside, the storm raged, as if the night itself was rising to claim their son. Father Callahan began the rites immediately, his voice steady but urgent as he read from the ancient book. The air thickened, heavy with a scent of burning sage and something fouler, like decay beneath earth. Jason lay motionless, but the faintest twitch of his fingers told them the fight wasn't over. The doll, placed on a small table, seemed to resist the holy words. Its glass eyes flickered wildly, reflecting shadows that shouldn't have been there. Suddenly, Jason's body arched violently, a guttural growl escaping his throat. Sarah jumped back, her heart pounding as she saw her son's limbs contort unnaturally. "Jesus Christ," Father Callahan muttered, raising the crucifix higher. The doll rocked back and forth, slowly, as if alive, whispering in a voice only Jason could hear. "You belong to me, Jason. Forever." Jason's lips moved, but the words were not his own. His voice layered, twisted, speaking in tongues older than time. Mark and Sarah clung to each other, watching helplessly as their son wrestled with the darkness inside him. Hours passed, the ritual ongoing, the house trembling as unseen forces pushed back. Finally, with a scream that split the night, Jason's body went limp. Father Callahan exhaled sharply. For now, it's subdued. But the demon won't let go easily. Sarah bent down, cradling Jason's face. His eyes were glassy, but she whispered softly, "We'll save you. I promise." Outside, the storm began to fade, but the shadows in the house lingered, waiting. And the doll, once again silent, sat still. Days passed in a fragile quiet. Jason slept endlessly, pale and drained, as if the darkness inside him had been pushed away but not destroyed. Sarah and Mark took turns sitting by his bedside, haunted by the shadows that seemed to flicker at the edge of their vision. Father Callahan warned them repeatedly, the demon's hold was not easily broken. "This is just the beginning," he said grimly. "The doll is a vessel. It binds to the soul." One evening, as Sarah sat reading by the dim lamp, a soft, almost imperceptible giggle echoed from Jason's room. Her heart stopped. She hurried inside to find the doll perched on Jason's chest, its eyes glowing faintly. "Jason," she whispered. He didn't move. Suddenly, the doll's head turned toward her, eyes blazing with cold fire. "Leave us," a voice hissed, a voice not Jason's, but something far older and crueler. Sarah stumbled back, fear flooding her veins. The doll's porcelain lips curled into a twisted smile. Mark arrived just in time, catching the doll before it fell. "We have to get rid of it," he said firmly. Father Callahan agreed. "The doll must be destroyed, or it will consume him." They gathered the doll and prepared a fire in the backyard. Flames flickered high, swallowing the delicate porcelain. But as the doll burned, a scream pierced the night, high, shrill, and filled with fury. Jason jolted awake, eyes wild and frantic. "No! Don't! It's still here." The fire sputtered and died suddenly, the doll reduced to ash, but the darkness lingered. From that night on, Jason's eyes sometimes flickered with shadows, his voice occasionally slipped into strange murmurs, whispering of promises made in the dark. Mark and Sarah realized this was no simple possession. It was a war for their son's soul. And the doll's whisper never truly stopped. The days grew colder, the nights longer. The house, once filled with laughter and light, now felt like a cage woven with shadows. Jason's recovery was slow, fractured by moments where his eyes would glaze over, and he'd speak words no child should know. Sarah sat by his bedside one night, clutching his hand, willing the warmth of her love to reach the places the darkness had taken. Suddenly, his fingers tightened around hers, and a soft voice, Jason's own, whispered, "Mom." I'm scared. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm here, baby. We're going to get through this. But just as hope flickered, the room grew cold. The lights dimmed, and a faint whisper curled through the air, the doll's voice, mocking, calling. He belongs to me now. Jason's body tensed. No, go away. Mark burst into the room, clutching a small wooden box of relics Father Callahan had given them, holy water, salt, and a silver knife. We have to fight this, Mark said grimly. Together, they began a ritual of protection, sprinkling salt along the thresholds, marking the walls with crosses, chanting prayers into the dark. Jason screamed, a terrible sound torn between pain and rage. The house shook, windows rattling as if a storm had erupted inside. Suddenly, silence fell. Jason collapsed, exhausted but free, at least for now. But in the corner of the room, shadows twisted and whispered, and Sarah knew the demon was waiting. Waiting for the moment to return. Weeks passed, and the Matthews home became a fortress of warded rooms and whispered prayers. But no matter what Mark and Sarah did, the darkness seeped through the cracks, like a slow poison infecting their lives. Jason began to retreat deeper into himself, his once bright eyes clouded with something unknowable. At times, he'd stare at the walls, speaking softly to someone unseen. I'm sorry, he whispered. She's angry. One night, Lily woke to a cold breath on her neck. She sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding, and saw the faint outline of the doll sitting on the floor, just beyond the moonlight. Lily, a voice hissed, join us. Terrified, she ran to her parents' room, but the words haunted her sleep. Meanwhile, Sarah caught Jason talking to the doll late one evening. Please, he pleaded, let me go. But the doll's answer was a sinister smile. Desperation mounting, Mark and Sarah reached out again to Father Callahan. He arrived with ancient texts, holy relics, and a grim determination. This spirit is powerful, he warned. It feeds on fear and doubt. We must stand strong. The family gathered in the living room, candles flickering, holy water sprinkled in arcs. Father Callahan began the exorcism. Jason writhed and screamed, the voices inside clashing in a brutal battle for control. Suddenly, the doll appeared, untouched by flame or time, hovering near Jason's face. Your soul is mine, it whispered. But Jason's eyes shone with something fierce, the boy fighting back. With a final cry, Father Callahan commanded the demon to leave. A terrifying howl filled the room as shadows fled, and Jason collapsed, gasping for breath. The house fell silent. For now. The quiet after the exorcism was deceptive. The house felt emptied, but the air remained thick with an unseen weight. Jason lay exhausted, drifting in and out of sleep, while Sarah and Mark exchanged fearful glances, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. Father Callahan closed his ancient book with a heavy sigh. The demon has been cast out, but it will try to return. The doll is the key. If it remains, the evil will come back. Sarah nodded, trembling. We have to destroy it. Mark hesitated. We tried before. It didn't work. Father Callahan shook his head. You must be prepared. Destroy it with fire and with faith. And never let it touch Jason again. The family gathered what was left of the doll, a few charred shards that had survived the earlier fire. Father Callahan sprinkled holy water and whispered prayers as they placed the pieces into a metal box. That night, they buried the box deep in the woods behind their house, sealing it with a final prayer. Jason slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The shadows in his eyes were gone. Days turned to weeks. The family slowly rebuilt their lives, laughter returning in small bursts. But one morning, Sarah found a small porcelain hand resting on Jason's pillow, pale, delicate, and unmistakably part of the doll. Her blood ran cold. From somewhere deep within the house, a faint whisper echoed. "I'm never gone." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the tiny porcelain hand. How could this be? They had buried the doll's remains deep in the woods, far from the house. Yet here it was, mocking them in the safety of Jason's room. Mark returned home to find Sarah pale and shaking, the hand clutched tightly in her fist. "This isn't over," she whispered. Jason, playing quietly in the living room, looked up and smiled, but it wasn't the same boy. His eyes flickered with the same cold gleam they once had. That night, the house groaned with unseen forces. Doors slammed shut on their own, shadows moved just beyond the edge of sight, and the whispers grew louder. Sarah and Mark barricaded themselves in Jason's room, clutching rosaries and clutching each other. They knew the demon was back, stronger and more relentless than ever. Suddenly, Jason's voice echoed from the hallway. "Why won't you let me go?" But when they opened the door, no one was there, only the doll's broken hand lying on the floor, its tiny fingers twitching. The darkness had returned. And this time, it wasn't leaving. Days slipped into restless nights, the Matthews family trapped in a shadowed nightmare that refused to end. Jason's laughter became rare, replaced by silence, or worse, murmurs that no parent should hear. One evening, Sarah sat alone in Jason's room, the faint glow of a single candle casting trembling shadows on the walls. The broken porcelain hand lay on the floor, still and cold, but Sarah's eyes were drawn to the doll's eyes, or rather, what had once been the doll's eyes, that now seemed to glimmer faintly in the dark. A whisper drifted through the room, barely audible, like a breath over her skin. "You can't bury what lies beneath." Jason's door creaked open slowly. He stood there, motionless, face pale and expressionless. His eyes were deep pools of darkness, reflecting something ancient and unfathomable. "Mom," he said softly, voice hollow yet unmistakably his own. Sarah reached out, but he stepped back, melting into the shadows as the whispering grew into a low chant, neither fully human nor demon, but something terrifyingly in between. Mark found her hours later, sitting on the floor with tears streaming silently down her face, the candle guttering out. The house stood quiet once more. But somewhere, deep beneath its foundations, something waited, patient, endless. Because some darkness doesn't fade. It only waits to be invited back. Next story. Where Shadows Dwell. Jonathan Park wiped the sweat from his brow as the moving truck rumbled away down the cracked lane. The late afternoon sun cast long, twisted shadows from the towering oaks that lined the narrow road leading to their new home. The house itself was an imposing Victorian, perched on the edge of Hollow Creek, its dark silhouette etched starkly against the fading sky. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the windows stared blankly like hollow eyes. Claire, his wife, wrapped her arms around their 7-year-old son, Alex, who was bouncing with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "It's bigger than I imagined," she whispered, her eyes tracing every cracked detail of the house's exterior. Jonathan smiled tiredly, exhaustion pulling at the edges of his smile. "Big enough for a fresh start." The front porch groaned beneath their feet as they pushed open the heavy oak door. A cold draft spilled out, carrying a faint metallic scent, something like rusted iron and old earth. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the heavy scent of aged wood. The floorboards creaked beneath their steps, and somewhere deep in the house, the distant drip of water echoed in slow, irregular beats. Alex's eyes widened as he explored the grand foyer, stepping lightly on a faded Persian rug. "It's like a castle," he exclaimed, brushing his hand over the cracked wallpaper and the peeling paint. Claire pulled him close. "Let's get settled before it gets dark." Jonathan began unpacking boxes while Claire lit candles to fight back the dim shadows gathering in the corners. But even as the warm flicker pushed back the gloom, the house seemed to breathe around them, whispering secrets from another time. That night, when the family was tucked into their beds, Jonathan lay awake listening. The house spoke in creaks and groans, sighs and taps. A faint tap-tap-tap echoed in the walls, rhythmic and insistent, like something waiting to be heard. He blinked against the darkness and tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the old wood settling. But deep in his bones, he felt eyes watching him. The next morning, the house seemed less ominous, bathed in sunlight. Birds sang outside and a gentle breeze fluttered the curtains. Still, the sense of unease clung to Jonathan's skin like a cold sweat. Claire was unpacking in the kitchen when she stumbled upon something wedged behind a loose pantry wall, a small wooden box carved with faded symbols, half forgotten and worn. The markings looked strange, twisting in ways that felt almost unnatural. "Jonathan, come see this," she called. He wiped his hands on his pants and came over, frowning at the box. Probably some old keepsake, he guessed, trying to keep his tone casual. That night, the tapping returned, louder, more urgent, moving through the house from ceiling to floor and back again. Alex refused to sleep in his room, his small body trembling with fear as he whispered about shadows whispering his name. "It's just the house making noises, buddy," Jonathan said, sitting beside him, trying to sound confident. "Old houses do that." But the whispers, Alex's eyes were wide and glassy. They said, "Stay." Claire stood in the doorway, arms crossed and worry etched into her face. "We should call someone. Maybe a locksmith, or get a security system installed." Jonathan nodded, though the pit of dread in his stomach only deepened. Something was wrong. The house wasn't just old, it was alive in ways they couldn't understand. By the third day, Jonathan found himself at the local library, digging through dusty archives and faded newspapers. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. The house was built in 1883 by a man named Elias Hollow, a recluse who vanished without a trace soon after finishing it. The house had been the site of strange deaths, neighbors disappearing, tragic accidents, unexplained screams that echoed across the Hollow Valley. Returning home, Jonathan shared the grim history with Claire and Alex by the firelight. "Maybe it's just stories," Claire said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to hold on to hope. Alex's small voice trembled. "What if it's real? What if they don't want us here?" Before anyone could answer, a sudden cold swept through the room. The flames flickered violently as a low, guttural moan rose from the walls themselves, vibrating through the floor and settling like a shroud over their hearts. Jonathan stood quickly, gripping the mantelpiece. "We'll be fine," he said, but even his voice sounded hollow. That night the house didn't sleep. The groaning grew louder, joined by the faint echo of footsteps pacing the long hallway outside their bedroom. Jonathan peeked through the crack in the door. Nothing but shadows danced on the peeling wallpaper. Yet a voice, barely more than a breath, whispered, "Leave, now." Claire insisted they stay together in the living room, where the walls seemed less oppressive. But even there, the temperature plummeted, and unseen fingers brushed against their skin. Alex whimpered, clutching his mother's hand. "They're here," he whispered. "They're angry." Days bled into restless nights. Objects moved when no one looked. Doors slammed shut on their own. Mirrors reflected flickering shapes that vanished when stared at directly. Jonathan began to keep a journal, noting the patterns, the cold spots, the tapping, the whispers. He tried contacting previous owners but found only silence or garbled messages. The house was a trap, a wound in the fabric of the world. One evening, a neighbor approached cautiously, eyes wide with fear. "You don't belong here," she said. Elias Hollow cursed this place. His spirit never left. He wants it back. Desperation crept in as the family faced a terrifying choice: fight the darkness gripping their home, or flee and abandon everything they had tried to build. But the house had already claimed them. The shadows in the hollow were patient. They waited. The nights grew colder still, and the house seemed to settle deeper into its own malevolence. Claire refused to let Alex sleep alone, and soon Jonathan found himself lying awake in the living room with both of them, the flicker of candlelight barely pushing back the overwhelming darkness. Every creak and groan was magnified in the silence, each whisper twisting into something more sinister. One night, as Jonathan paced the floorboards, trying to shake the dread pooling in his gut, a sudden slam echoed from upstairs. Alex gasped from the couch. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, eyes wide with terror. Jonathan nodded grimly. "I did." They sat frozen as the faint sound of footsteps slowly drifted down the hallway. They were soft at first, tentative, but with each step, they grew heavier, closer. Claire clutched Jonathan's arm. "Who's there?" she called out shakily. The house answered with a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Alex whimpered, pressing his face into Claire's shoulder. "Please, stop." Jonathan took a deep breath and forced himself to stand. "We need to see what's going on upstairs." Claire grabbed a flashlight, and with Alex trembling between them, they ascended the stairs. Each step creaked like a scream in the quiet night. Reaching the second-floor hallway, the flashlight beam caught a shadow slipping just beyond the edge of the stairwell. Jonathan's heart thundered. "Hello?" he called. No answer, only silence, heavy and waiting. As they moved down the hall, the air grew colder, the walls seeming to close in. A door at the far end stood slightly ajar, revealing only blackness inside. Jonathan stepped closer, pushing it open with a slow, deliberate motion. The beam revealed an empty room, but the cold was unbearable. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Alex screamed. Jonathan rushed to the door, shaking it, but it wouldn't budge. From the darkness, a voice hissed, "You shouldn't have come back." The flashlight flickered violently, then went dark. In the pitch black, the whispers began, hundreds of voices murmuring in a chorus of anger and sorrow. Claire sobbed quietly, holding Alex close. Jonathan felt something brush his neck, cold and rough, like dead fingers. And then, silence. A single breath, exhaled close to his ear. "Stay, forever." Jonathan's chest tightened as the breath whispered near his ear. His skin prickled with cold, every instinct screaming to flee, but his hands gripped the doorknob tightly, pounding against the cold wood. Claire was clutching Alex, her tears wet against the boy's hair, his small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. The voices whispered again, a low chant that slithered around them like smoke curling through the room. Jonathan forced himself to steady his breathing. "We have to get out," he said, voice barely more than a rasp. Suddenly, the door creaked open, as if pushed by unseen hands. The beam of the flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the empty room bathed in an unnatural cold glow. The walls were smeared with something dark. Stains like dried blood tracing unnatural patterns that pulsed and writhed under the flashlight's gaze. Alex tugged at Jonathan's sleeve, his voice barely audible. "Dad, did you see that? The shadows, they moved." Jonathan swallowed hard and pulled the family toward the hallway. Every step they took, the house seemed to shift around them, the floors stretching and groaning beneath their feet. As they descended the stairs, the air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. From the living room below, the fireplace flickered, though no wood was burning. From within the hearth, faint red embers glowed like eyes watching their every move. Claire stopped, her breath catching. "We're not alone," she whispered. Jonathan nodded grimly. "We never were." Outside, the night was silent, but the house behind them seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, slow, steady, unyielding. That night, Jonathan sat by the window, the curtains drawn tight, staring out into the darkness beyond the trees. His thoughts raced through every terrifying moment. What had Elias Hollow done? What curse had he woven into the very timbers? He could still hear the whispers, carried on the wind through the cracks and crevices of the old home. Alex's voice broke the silence from behind him. "Dad?" Jonathan turned. The boy's face was pale, eyes wide with a fear deeper than any child's. "Will it ever stop?" Alex asked. Jonathan reached out, pulling him into a hug. "We'll figure it out. We have to." But in the shadows, the house waited. Patient. Hungry. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching their every move with unseen eyes. Days blended into nights in a relentless cycle of fear and exhaustion. Claire barely slept, often found whispering prayers under her breath, while Alex clung to her like a lifeline, his small hands trembling as he stared at the corners where shadows pooled thickest. One afternoon, Jonathan decided he had to understand the house, to face whatever darkness gripped it. He pored over old newspaper clippings and faded town records at the local library, piecing together the story of Elias Hollow and the tragedies that stained the house's history. Elias had been an obsessed man, a recluse driven mad by grief after losing his wife and child to illness. Legend said he dabbled in dark rituals, trying to bind their souls to the house, trapping them there forever. Townsfolk whispered that the house was cursed, a beacon for restless spirits, twisted by Elias's desperation. Returning home, Jonathan felt the weight of the knowledge pressing down on him. He shared what he learned with Claire and Alex, who listened with wide, fearful eyes. "We need to leave," Claire said, voice shaking. "This place isn't just haunted, it's a prison." But Jonathan shook his head. "We can't run. Not yet. We have to fight this. For Alex." That night, the house erupted into chaos. The temperature plunged so low their breath fogged the air. Doors slammed open and shut violently, glass shattered without cause, and from the walls came the mournful wails of unseen voices. Alex screamed as a shadow slithered across the floor toward him. Claire caught him just in time, pulling him into her arms. Jonathan ran through the house, desperate for answers. In the attic, beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, he found a hidden journal belonging to Elias Hollow. The pages were filled with frantic scrawlings, incantations, pleas, and dark confessions. One passage chilled Jonathan to his core. The souls bind the house, and the house binds the souls. To break the curse, the blood of the last hollow must be shed within these walls. Jonathan's heart pounded. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it demanded a terrible sacrifice. As the storm outside howled, Jonathan realized they were trapped. Not just by the house's walls, but by the shadows within, waiting for the final reckoning. Jonathan clutched the brittle journal tightly, the words seeming to burn through the thin pages and into his mind. The air around him grew colder still, the attic shadows lengthening, stretching like dark fingers toward him. He heard the faintest whisper, almost like a breath, calling his name, distant but insistent. He swallowed hard, fighting the urge to flee, knowing somehow that the house was testing him, probing for weakness. Back downstairs, Claire and Alex sat huddled near the fireplace, its flickering flames a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Claire's eyes were red-rimmed, exhaustion etched deep on her face. Jonathan lowered himself beside them, voice trembling but firm. "There's a way to break this," he said. "But it's dangerous. The curse binds the house and the souls trapped inside. And to undo it, something has to give, someone with the blood of Hollow." Alex looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you saying, me?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "I don't know. But if the curse isn't broken, this house won't let us go." Suddenly, the lights flickered violently and then died, plunging them into thick darkness. The walls seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm. From the shadows came a low, guttural chant, rising steadily into a cacophony of tortured voices. Claire grabbed Alex's hand, whispering, "We have to stay together." Jonathan reached for the old iron key he had found earlier in the house. He didn't know what it opened, but the journal hinted at hidden doors and secret chambers. They moved through the house as the voices grew louder, following the pull of an unseen force toward the basement door, a heavy slab of oak that pulsed with cold. Jonathan inserted the key, and the door creaked open to reveal a staircase descending into blackness. The smell of earth and decay filled their nostrils. Step by slow step, they descended. At the bottom, the air was thick, suffocating. Symbols were etched into the stone walls, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, stained dark with age. A single drop of water fell from the ceiling, hitting the altar with a sharp plink, echoing like a death knell. Alex clung to Claire, eyes wide as the chanting surged around them, voices demanding, pleading, angry. Jonathan swallowed his fear and stepped toward the altar, realizing that the house's true horror was about to unfold. Jonathan's breath hitched as he stepped closer to the altar, the chilling glow from the etched symbols casting twisted shadows across the cold stone. The oppressive air felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, squeezing until his ribs ached. Claire tightened her grip on Alex's trembling hand, whispering soothing words he barely heard over the rising chorus of voices. The voices swirled around them, overlapping chants in strange, guttural tones that seemed older than time itself. Jonathan's heart hammered fiercely, but he forced himself forward. His eyes caught a faint glimmer on the altar, a rusted dagger, its blade stained with dark, dried residue. "This must be it," Jonathan murmured, recalling the journal's cryptic warning. "The blood of Hollow." Alex's small voice broke through the chanting. "Dad, what's going to happen?" Jonathan looked down at his son, fighting back tears. "I don't know, but we have to be brave." Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the chanting shifted into desperate screams, cries of pain and rage. The house groaned, as if awakening from a long slumber, its walls trembling with unseen fury. Claire's voice cracked. "Jonathan, please, don't do this." But Jonathan felt the pull of something ancient and terrible, a force demanding sacrifice, demanding an end. He raised the dagger, its cold handle sending a shiver up his arm. Alex whimpered, tears streaming down his cheeks. Claire clung to both of them, sobbing. As Jonathan's hand trembled over the blade, the shadows thickened, coalescing into vague shapes, faces twisted in agony, reaching out from the darkness. A voice, deep and hollow, echoed through the chamber. The last hollow must pay the price. The chanting crescendoed, and the house seemed to pulse in time with Jonathan's racing heart. He closed his eyes, the weight of the moment crushing down. The choice loomed, to break the curse, to free the trapped souls, but at what cost? The shadows waited. The house waited. And Jonathan made his decision. Jonathan's fingers trembled as they hovered over the rusted dagger resting on the cold stone altar. The air around him thickened, heavy with an ancient presence that seemed to seep from the very walls of the chamber. The faint, eerie glow from the etched symbols flickered uncertainly, casting twisting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Every breath he took felt labored, as if the air itself resisted filling his lungs. The low chorus of voices, neither fully human nor wholly spectral, rose in a sinister symphony, their language indecipherable but laden with a cruel urgency. The walls seemed to pulse rhythmically, a slow and mournful heartbeat echoing through the damp stone, matching the rapid thudding of Jonathan's own heart. Claire's grip on Alex tightened, her whispered prayers tangled with the mounting cacophony. Alex's wide eyes glistened in the dim light, reflecting a mixture of terror and something deeper, an unspoken understanding of the darkness encroaching on them. His small fingers curled into his mother's, nails digging in as though to anchor himself to reality. Jonathan forced himself to focus, every nerve screaming for escape, yet bound by a compulsion older than his own will. The dagger felt impossibly cold against his skin, its blade etched with faint, unreadable runes that seemed to writhe beneath the flickering light, as if alive. A drop of water fell from the jagged ceiling, striking the altar with a crisp, metallic plink. The sound reverberated through the chamber, marking the passage of time in an oppressive stillness that followed. For a moment, everything froze, the chanting ceased, the shadows stilled, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then, in the silence, a voice emerged, deep and hollow, resonating through the darkness like a dirge. It spoke a single phrase in a voice both distant and intimate: "The last hollow must pay." Jonathan's mind reeled. Was this a warning? A promise? Or a curse? The line between past and present, between his own will and the house's dark intent, blurred into a disorienting haze. He looked down at Alex, whose eyes were now fixed on him with an eerie stillness, lips moving silently as if reciting some unseen prayer. Claire's sobs had slowed to a trembling hush, her body rigid with fear and resolve. The shadows began to writhe again, shifting and reshaping, sometimes forming faces contorted in silent screams, sometimes melting into tendrils that seemed to reach toward Jonathan's outstretched hand. The dagger seemed to pulse in his grip, the boundary between metal and shadow indistinct, as if the blade itself were alive, eager for release. Jonathan closed his eyes, the weight of choice pressing down like a physical force. To act meant sacrifice, but what kind? His own? Alex's? Claire's? Or something else, something the house demanded but would never reveal? Time stretched and folded. The whispers returned, weaving around them like silk and poison. The altar beneath his hand felt less like stone and more like a living thing, throbbing with anticipation. And in that ambiguous moment, caught between despair and hope, fear and courage, Jonathan made a decision that would bind them all, for better or worse, to the shadows in the hollow. Jonathan's eyes snapped open. The weight in his chest was suffocating, as if invisible hands pressed down on him, holding him to the cold altar. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick and viscous. The shadows coiled tighter, creeping like smoke, their whispers swelling into a terrible symphony of murmurs, cries, and laughter, unfathomable yet hauntingly familiar. The dagger felt impossibly heavy now, as though the metal absorbed the darkness itself. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting not the candlelight but some deep, otherworldly glow, like embers beneath ash. Jonathan's fingers ached, numb but unwilling to release the blade. It was as if the house had rooted itself inside his palm, binding him to a fate older than time. Alex's face was pale, eyes wide with an eerie calm that unsettled Jonathan more than any scream. "Dad," he whispered, voice thin and distant, "they're waiting." Claire's trembling hands clasped his arm. "We don't belong here," she breathed, eyes darting to the shifting forms along the walls, faces contorted in silent agony, mouths moving but no sound escaping. "This place is alive, and it's hungry." Jonathan's gaze flickered to the altar, where the stones seemed to pulse beneath the dagger like a beating heart. A sudden breeze stirred the stale air, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay, something ancient, buried beneath layers of sorrow. Then came the voice again, low, resonant, a sound that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. "You cannot choose," it said, "for the house chooses." The chamber warped. Walls stretched and bent, the symbols glowing brighter, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Time fractured. Moments folding into one another, past bleeding into present. Jonathan saw glimpses, a man with hollow eyes standing in this very room centuries ago, a woman weeping silently in the corner, a child's laughter twisted into a scream. They all turned to him, their faces masks of despair and accusation. His grip tightened on the dagger, but doubt gnawed at him. Was this sacrifice salvation or doom? Could the curse ever be undone, or was this the beginning of a new bondage? Claire's voice broke through the turmoil, soft but fierce. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Alex nodded, his small hand slipping into Jonathan's, grounding him. The shadows pulsed, waiting, hungry. The house whispered. And Jonathan felt the last thread of certainty unravel into the endless dark. Jonathan felt the cold stone beneath his knees as the chamber seemed to pulse with a rhythm older than the earth itself. His breath hitched. The shadows crawling along the walls now seemed less like mere darkness and more like living things, writhing, whispering, breathing. He dared to glance at Alex, who sat quietly beside Claire, his eyes unnervingly still, reflecting a maturity far beyond his 7 years. The boy's small hand clung to Jonathan's with surprising strength. The whispered voices slithered through the air, weaving around them, words just out of reach of comprehension, but heavy with meaning and despair. The dagger in Jonathan's hand felt like an extension of his very soul, cold and yet pulsating with a faint warmth beneath the surface. He wrestled with the unbearable ambiguity of the moment. Was this the path to freedom, or merely the house tightening its grip? The symbols on the walls burned brighter, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and flickered like ancient spirits imprisoned in the stone. Claire's voice trembled, breaking the thick silence. "Jonathan, what if we can't break free? What if the house is the end of us?" He looked into her eyes, searching for courage, finding only raw fear mirrored there. His throat tightened. "We don't know yet," he whispered. "But we can't give up." Suddenly, the chamber shifted. The floor beneath them felt unstable, the very walls seeming to breathe, exhale, contract. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood long dried but never forgotten. Faint shapes emerged from the shadows, faces etched with sorrow and rage, their mouths moving in silent lament. Jonathan felt a chill run through him as a whisper grazed his ear, barely audible but chilling in its intent. The blood must answer. He glanced down at the dagger's blade, now shimmering like liquid silver, reflecting not the chamber around them but a swirling void. His hand shook, uncertainty clawing at him. He wanted to believe this was the way to save his family, but doubt gnawed at his resolve. Alex suddenly spoke, his voice eerily calm. "Dad, what if it's not about sacrifice? What if it's about understanding?" The room seemed to pause, the whispers dimming as if considering the child's words. The flickering shadows softened, the faces less torment and more watchful, waiting. Jonathan looked at his son, then at Claire. In that fragile moment, the impossible felt within reach, a choice not just of blood and sacrifice, but of will, love, and the unknown. The house waited, silent now, as if holding its breath. And Jonathan, heart pounding, realized that what came next would change everything, though whether it would be salvation or damnation remained hidden in the shadows. The chamber seemed to exhale, a slow, shuddering breath that sent a ripple through the air like the surface of a dark, still lake disturbed. Jonathan tightened his grip on the dagger, the cold steel a strange comfort amidst the oppressive weight pressing down from the walls themselves. Claire knelt beside Alex, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His eyes held a depth that unsettled her. The innocence of childhood twisted with something far older, far darker. The whispered voices had fallen to a hush, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any sound. Jonathan's gaze flicked back to the altar. The glowing symbols flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows that pooled and writhed as if alive. The stone beneath his hand was no longer cold, but pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat in slow, uneven rhythm. He could feel it, not just under his palm, but throughout the very room, as though the house itself were a living entity, its breath syncing with their own. A distant echo reverberated through the chamber, something like a soft lullaby sung in a tongue forgotten by time. It was soothing and terrifying all at once, threading through the heavy air and threading into Jonathan's mind like a dream half remembered, a promise half broken. He hesitated, torn between the desperate urge to end the nightmare and the creeping suspicion that whatever power lay here was beyond his understanding or control. Was this a test? A trap? Or something else entirely? Alex whispered again, voice barely audible. Maybe the house wants us to see, to listen. Claire shivered but nodded slowly. Maybe it's not about fighting. Maybe it's about accepting. Jonathan's heart hammered, every instinct screaming to flee, but something rooted him in place, a fragile hope mingled with dread. The dagger, the altar, the house, they were all parts of a story still unfolding, secrets waiting to be unveiled. The chamber darkened further as the last candle guttered low. The shadows shifted, coalescing into shapes, faces, hands, memories, that reached out, not to harm, but to beckon. The house was no longer just a prison, it was a story, wound, a whisper carried through generations. And now, the choice lay in their hands. Not a simple sacrifice, but a step into the unknown. Jonathan closed his eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. Jonathan slowly opened his eyes, the chamber around him shifting like a waking dream. The faces in the shadows, some twisted with pain, others serene, melted away into a soft darkness that seemed to pulse with quiet life. The oppressive weight lifted just enough for him to catch his breath, but the sense of being watched never left. Claire squeezed Alex's hand tightly, her knuckles white with tension. The boy's gaze was steady, as though something inside him had changed, as if the house's whispers had settled into a strange kind of understanding. Jonathan felt the dagger grow warm in his palm, its blade shimmering like a thread of silver light. It was no longer just a weapon, but a key, or perhaps a question, waiting for an answer. The room around them seemed to breathe in time with his heartbeat, the very stones humming with ancient energy. A soft murmur rose from the walls, barely audible, yet unmistakably a voice. It spoke in fractured words, half-forgotten phrases from long ago. Release, bind, blood and bone, home, hollow. Jonathan's mind raced. The house was not just a place of torment, it was a vessel of memory, grief, and something like hope tangled in the darkness. Alex whispered, maybe we don't have to fight the house. Maybe we have to listen. Claire nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. To understand. Jonathan looked from his wife to his son, the weight of the moment settling over him like a shroud. The house waited, not with malice, but with a longing that stretched across centuries. He raised the dagger, not in sacrifice, but in invitation. The blade pulsed softly, a heartbeat of light in the dim chamber. The shadows shifted once more, and for a fleeting moment, Jonathan glimpsed a figure, a man with hollow eyes and an unspoken sorrow, standing beyond the veil of time, watching, waiting. The house whispered its secrets, and Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. Jonathan felt the weight of that silent figure's gaze, a presence both distant and intimately close, as if woven from the very fabric of the house itself. The shadows flickered, stretching and curling like smoke drifting through unseen cracks in time. The air hung heavy with a quiet tension, fragile yet charged with the echoes of lives long past. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed closer to Alex. "Do you feel it too?" she whispered. Alex nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the shifting darkness ahead. "It's like the house is breathing," waiting for us to understand. Jonathan swallowed hard. Then we listened. He lowered the dagger gently to the altar. The runes etched into the stone pulsed faintly, each beat resonating with a history that refused to be forgotten. It was not just a place of torment, but a vessel of stories, of love and loss, of desperation and hope tangled within the walls. The chamber grew quieter, the oppressive weight lifting to reveal a stillness that hummed with possibility. Suddenly, from the depths of the shadows, a soft, sorrowful melody began to rise, a lullaby carried on the breath of the house itself. It wrapped around them, weaving through their memories and fears, touching the edges of their souls. Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Maybe this is the way out, the way through. Jonathan looked at his family, the fragile thread of connection stronger than the darkness pressing in. "We're not alone," he said softly. "And maybe that's the key." The figure in the shadows seemed to nod, a gesture of both farewell and welcome. The walls shimmered, the chamber dissolving into a haze of light and shadow. As the dawn's first pale light crept through the cracks of the old house, Jonathan, Claire, and Alex found themselves standing at the threshold, changed, yet somehow freed. The house remained, silent and watching, waiting for the next story to unfold within its hollowed heart. Jonathan blinked as the haze of shadows and light dissolved around them, revealing the familiar foyer of the old house bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The air was lighter now, the oppressive heaviness lifted but replaced by an eerie stillness that hummed quietly beneath the surface. The house seemed to breathe calmly, as if it had exhaled centuries of sorrow and settled into a long-awaited peace. Claire reached out, touching the worn banister with reverent fingers. "It feels different," she whispered. "Like the house is waiting." Alex looked around, his eyes sharp and curious instead of wide with fear. "Do you think it remembers us?" Jonathan hesitated. The house was no longer just wood and stone, it was a living memory, a palimpsest of lives entwined in grief and hope. The shadows that once clawed at their sanity had softened into whispers, stories carried gently on the breath of the walls. In the days that followed, strange things happened. Not the terrifying hauntings of before, but subtle signs, almost like echoes. The faint scent of lavender in the hallway, a soft lullaby humming through the vents, footsteps that led them to forgotten corners filled with old photographs and letters. It was as if the house was opening itself to them, inviting them to understand its past. One evening, Jonathan sat alone in the parlor, reading an old letter he had found tucked behind a loose brick. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, the words soaked in sorrow and love. "If this house remembers, then so must we. For the stories buried here are not chains but keys. To understand is to begin to heal." Jonathan felt a strange calm settle over him. The house was no longer a prison but a guardian of memories, both dark and tender, waiting for those who could listen, learn, and carry the weight forward. But beneath this fragile peace lingered a question, unspoken and unresolved. Had the house truly released them? Or had they become part of its endless story, threads woven into the hollow walls, waiting to whisper to the next family brave enough to listen? The sun set beyond the ancient oaks, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the porch. Inside, the house waited, silent, patient, alive. And the story, it seemed, was far from over. The days turned into weeks, and life settled into an uneasy rhythm within the old house. The oppressive weight that had once suffocated Jonathan, Claire, and Alex had lifted, replaced by a quiet stillness that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. Yet the house was no longer simply a place to live. It had become a presence, an entity entwined with their very existence. Alex, once terrified of the shadows, began to explore with a cautious curiosity. He found himself drawn to corners of the house he'd never dared enter before, darkened attics filled with forgotten relics, dusty basements where the air smelled of earth and memories. Sometimes he would sit for hours, tracing the faded patterns on the wallpaper or listening to the faintest murmur carried on the breeze. Claire, too, felt a shift. Her nights were still restless, but no longer haunted by screaming shadows. Instead, she dreamed of faces, strangers from another time whose eyes held both sorrow and longing. She began to write, filling pages with fragments of those dreams, attempting to capture the stories whispered by the house. Jonathan found himself drawn back to the journal of Elias Hollow, rereading the frantic scrawlings with new understanding. The man's grief and desperation were no longer distant tales but felt like echoes within his own heart. Jonathan began searching the town archives for more, piecing together the lives that had intersected in this house, and how each had left a mark. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows through the ancient windows, Alex came running to Jonathan with a folded piece of paper. "Dad, look what I found behind the panel in my room." Jonathan unfolded the fragile parchment, revealing a faded sketch of the house, surrounded by cryptic symbols and a single word scrawled at the bottom: "Remember." It was a reminder, not just to remember the past, but to acknowledge that they were now part of the house's ongoing story. The curse, the sorrow, the restless spirits, they were threads woven into a tapestry that stretched beyond their understanding. Though the house had ceased its torment, it had not forgotten. And neither had the family. They realized that their new home was less a place to escape darkness and more a bridge between worlds, a vessel for stories waiting to be told and heard. And so, they lived, not as prisoners, but as guardians of the Hollow's secrets, carrying forward the delicate balance between fear and hope, shadow and light. The house waited patiently, its walls whispering softly in the twilight, always ready to welcome those who dared to listen. As the weeks slipped quietly into months, the house seemed to settle into a rhythm all its own, its breath slow and steady but never quite at rest. Jonathan, Claire, and Alex adapted to this uneasy coexistence, but something lingered, an intangible thread of unease that wove through their days and haunted their nights. At times, the house felt warm, even welcoming. The creak of the floorboards beneath their feet was almost like a heartbeat, steady and familiar. Soft murmurs drifted through the halls, snatches of conversation, laughter, or tears, that vanished the moment they tried to focus on them. But shadows never fully retreated. In quiet moments, Jonathan would catch a glimpse of movement just beyond his vision, shapes dissolving into the dark corners of rooms, or a flicker in the reflection of a window when no one else was there. Claire sometimes awoke to soft singing, barely audible, echoing through the walls like a lullaby sung from long ago. Alex grew more distant, often staring out the window for hours, eyes reflecting the fading light. One evening, Claire found him standing at the edge of the forest behind the house, whispering secrets to the trees as if they were old friends. "Who are you talking to?" she asked softly. Alex smiled, a shadow flickering across his face. "The house remembers," he said. "It knows things. It talks to me sometimes." Jonathan watched his son with a mixture of awe and dread. The boy seemed changed. Part of the house and yet apart from it, straddling a line Jonathan couldn't understand. One night, during a storm that rattled the windows and shook the foundations, the family gathered in the parlor, the only room where the air felt least oppressive. Outside, lightning split the sky, casting the house's twisted silhouette against the turbulent clouds. Suddenly, the power flickered and died. In the suffocating dark, a voice, neither wholly human nor spectral, whispered through the silence. "Home is not where you live, but where you belong." The walls seemed to pulse with that unspoken truth. The house had welcomed them, marked them, and perhaps, claimed them. As the storm raged on, Jonathan glanced at his family, Claire's face pale but calm, Alex's eyes reflecting something ancient and unreadable, and realized that their story was far from over. The house waited, patient and eternal. And so did the shadows. Jonathan's gaze drifted to the cracked windowpane where rain hammered like whispered warnings. The house seemed to breathe with them, its ancient heartbeat echoing beneath the storm's fury. Claire's hand found his, cool and steady, but in Alex's eyes, Jonathan saw something that neither of them fully understood. Something waiting. The house was not just a home. It was a sentinel, a keeper of secrets, a place where time folded back on itself and where the past never truly died. The shadows weren't merely specters but echoes, fragments of a story still being told. As the candle's flame flickered, casting long, trembling shapes across peeling wallpaper, Jonathan realized that they were woven into the fabric of the house. Their presence stirred the walls, whispered through the floorboards, and became part of the endless cycle of memory, loss, and restless longing. Outside, the storm began to wane, but inside, a new quiet settled. It was not peace, exactly, but a fragile truce, a pause in the dance between light and darkness. The house waited. Always waiting. And Jonathan knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that one day, the shadows would stir again. That the story was far from finished. Because some places don't let go. They don't forget. They wait. Waiting for the next footsteps in the hall. Waiting for the next whisper in the dark. Waiting for the next family to come home. The wind moaned softly through the trees as the first light of dawn seeped into the corners of the old house, but inside, a cold shadow lingered still. Silent, patient, eternal.